Hello and welcome to you all. My name is Donegal Bachoin. I'm a professor of politics at Dublin City University. And a quarter century ago, back in the year 2000, I started living and working in the post-Soviet space, first in Georgia, then in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Moldova. So all told, I've spent more than a decade living in the region and carried out field research in all 15 of the post-Soviet republics. And some of that research conducted during that time has been distilled in my book, Unfinished Empire, Russian Imperialism in Ukraine and the Near Abroad, which will be published in May. Thus, I'm very happy to be invited to introduce and moderate our discussion today. Against the backdrop of Russia's continued war in Ukraine, setbacks for the Kremlin, such as Ukraine's advance into the Kursk region, have raised questions regarding popular support for the war in Russia. As the casualties continue to climb, the Russian armed forces have to increase payments to induce volunteers, indicating growing difficulties in sourcing manpower to continue the invasion. Meanwhile, criticism from nationalists offer potential insights into discourses in Russia about the war. To discuss this important topic, we're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jade McGlynn, Leverhulme Early Career Postdoctoral Fellow at King's College London. Dr. Jade McGlynn will give a presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we will go to Q&A. You will be able to join the discussion using the Q&A function on Zoom. To ensure that we have time to ask questions, please feel free to send your questions in throughout the session, and we can ask them after Dr. McGlynn has finished her presentation. Please note that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record, and you can join the discussion on X, or Twitter, as I still prefer to call it, using the handle at IIEA. I will now formally introduce Dr. McGlynn and hand over to her. Jade McGlynn is the author of Russia's War and Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. She's an academic based at King's College London. Her research focuses on Russia's war against Ukraine since 2014 through the lens of identity and propaganda. She frequently writes for the international media and is also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Europe program. She splits her time between the UK and Kharkiv, where she co-founded the Free Ukraine Fund to assist the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So Dr. McGlynn, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Donegal. I apologize to the audience that I sound slightly like Donald Duck because of all of the horrible bugs that are going around at the moment and having two young children, but hopefully the tea will see me through. As Donna explained, I'm going to be talking today a little bit about, I think, a group that perhaps, whilst not representing a majority by any means in Russia, still provides some insights into some of the at least discursive, if not political, trends that are happening. And I want to talk about a group that I call the Patriotic Policy Critics, and whether or not over time they might become a nationalist opposition. So there we are. Who are they? Seems like a good place to start. So patriotic policy critics in Russia are influential figures with political or media platforms, often on Telegram, who support the war on Ukraine but are often critical of its execution. Their allegiance lies with the objectives of the war. So in other words, they're politicized, which we can't say about, unfortunately, large swathes of the population in Russia, which tend more towards apathy in itself, caused by propaganda, which often doesn't try to make people political, but instead makes them apathetic or believe nothing can be changed. They're also capable of public discourse, which again is a problem not only in Russia, but generally has been a larger problem in the post-Soviet world, because you have official discourse, you have private discourse, and then where's public discourse? And so this group is, I don't want to say unique, but they're marked by this. I'd say that their views align with parts of the population, definitely not a majority, probably we're talking about 20 to 25%. They're often described just as nationalist bloggers, but I think we're not really talking about just nationalists, but also parts of the Slavophile groups, parts of the authoritarians, and then parts of a group that we might call sort of anxious. And that's really what the terrible diagram represents, is this idea of where different groups, let's say, that we might identify through the admittedly problematic forms of polling that we can still access, the different groups that we might have. And here the idea is that, yes, you have your pro-war nationalists, who would be, I suppose, the ideal patriotic policy critics, but because they actively support the war, there also potentially can be a problem, unlike people who support it in a more ritual way. The good thing, the reason why patriotic policy critics are able to criticize in ways that, for example, pro-Western liberals aren't, is because they're also able to mobilize. And as Donahoe was talking about in his introduction, there's problems with mobilizing people for the war. And that's an area where the military bloggers, the Voyenkori in particular, have been they've been successful. They've had successes. They've also come across as sort of more authentic, certainly than state propagandists, with whom they often have kind of online arguments. So thinking in particular around the time of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, there was a lot of arguments between Solovyov and a particular channel called Two Majors, which will come up again in this presentation. But by these reports, by telling something a little bit closer to the truth, and also through sort of various grassroots activities, they've gained some legitimacy, particularly among Russian soldiers, their partners, veterans, and nationalist hardliners. And therefore, I would say that they're an interesting and significant force in Russian nationalist politics and in Russian politics, such as it is. They make up different groups. I'm going to go quite quickly through this section just because I think it's more interesting to get into some of the findings. And I should clarify that these findings and any figures that are referenced, they come from a sort of large study that I did originally in 2024. So we looked at around 380,000 Telegram posts from patriotic policy critics to understand sort of what are they interested in, what do they like to moan about, what are they happy about, very little, and how do they interact with each other. So one group is the military bloggers. So this is the group of people who you wouldn't really call them war correspondents because they're often not linked to an official channel, but some of them have been in Ukraine since 2014, and they provide a much more visceral and much closer to the truth, authentic version of what the war is like, as opposed to state media, which is very much about how everything's going great. We also have the Wagner affiliated groups. So this has obviously changed. Wagner used to have more popularity before Prigozhin went a bit too far. So now you have pro-state Wagner remnants who were pretty much under Russian military control in different areas. They've sort of been dispersed. But you also have anti-Kremlin Wagner nationalists. So thinking in particular here of channels like Alex Parker Returns, which are directly critical of Putin. So they tend to be extremely militaristic, as you would expect, and a big distrust. And often among the anti-Kremlin Wagnerites, a real loyalty to Prigozhin still. Ethno-nationalists, so that's what it says on the tin, don't like migrants. Some of them originally opposed the war as a sense of, well, we should be fighting the non-white enemy within. But they've kind of come around to it. Some of them, such as the Rusich neo-Nazi paramilitary group, they've been active and also responsible for a large number of war crimes. And then you have the PPC, the patriotic policy critics on the margin. So these would be your Ukrainian collaborators since 2014, people like Oleg Tsaryov, people who was the victim of an assassination attempt by the resistance of Ukraine a couple of years back. And then your sort of pro-Kremlin Chechens who are also critical, but Chechens occupy their own space, which we're not going to have time to get into today. But this picture is a picture of Ramzan, of the general Abdi Aladuinov, of the Kadyrovite forces, the Akhmat Brigade, and he's the one in the cap. And then the other guy without a cap is a guy called Mikhail Chkov, and he is the commander of the neo-Nazi Rusich battalion. And when the Ukrainian soldiers went into Kursk, there was a lot of criticism of the Chechens because they were supposed to be keeping that area secure. And following that, the battalion belonging to Mikhail without the cap killed and mutilated and cut up a Chechen soldier from the Kadyrov Sea. And so the reason why I've included this image is because it's an important reminder before we go into some of the topics we're about to discuss that they are still all completely subordinated to state control when it really comes down to it. So they have this space, but they have this space to discuss because they're allowed it for certain reasons, not because they are a true kind of opposition. And, even the most extreme, such as Rusic, who are full-on neo-Nazis, even they can be brought into tow. And as you can see from the commander's not very happy face, forced to take a photograph with, sworn enemies. So that's who they are. The Telegram sort of ecosystem is pretty diverse, is interconnected. They each kind of push different narratives, but there are some common themes, and there are some shared concerns, ideology, etc. So if we look at this kind of analysis, we see different ones. So Yekaterina Muzilina, who's much closer to the government, many rumor that she's having an affair with Vladimir Putin, so definitely closer than a lot of the others. She is sort of much more ideologically focused, much more about traditional values. And then right on the other side, at the bottom, we see Rusic, so the neo-Nazis from the previous photograph. On the edge, on my right, well, on the left, we see Alexander Hodorkovsky, who's from Luhansk. Well, he's a Ukrainian collaborator, often more critical of the war, what is the point of it? And then we see the broad mass of the kind of war correspondence around here. But in general, we do see, so we see this kind of in the middle, a general kind of consensus. So there are people who have more of a focus on certain areas, but in general, the war and a very kind of, well, we'll look in a second at what their kind of main arguments around the war are, but that's what sort of unites them is the war and these different points. So the ethno-nationalists and the ideologues who are more imperialist nationalists, they're quite close. And military bloggers obviously are at the center. So the war acts as a bit of a bridge between nationalist ideology and military strategy. And here in this image as well, you can see about some of the retweets. So you can see how the different groups do and do not connect with each other, which is interesting because unlike with shared concerns where we see very similar topics, what we see here is there is no real center. And whilst there are a few groups that kind of retweet each other, or a few actors that retweet each other, in general, they're kind of isolated from one another, which suggests that we're talking here about, as does some qualitative research, that we're talking about elite interests rather than a kind of political movement. So we see a small number of channels dominating the information flow. We see two types of aggregators. We see the isolated one. It's worth noting that obviously there's an element of isolation to all of them, but yeah, I mean, some of them distribute more widely, some of them just distribute within their kind of ideological bubble. And the Chechen and the Nazi network, so Nazi being kind of Rusic, Russian imperial movement, these spaces, they often have kind of their own, I don't want to say entirely separate, but quite distinct patterns and distinct networks. So what does all of this sort of suggest about the kind of Telegram nationalist battleground? It's a battleground for elite rivalries, like everything in Russia, it feels. So Prigozhin before, now pro-Prigozhin, they used Telegram to attack the Ministry of Defense, which is obviously something you couldn't do on state television. Kadyrov's network is quite careful at curating and distributing content that praises Chechnya, praises Kadyrov, but aligns it to the Kremlin, but also allows for some criticism, often not of the leadership, but of Russia. The military bloggers, they shape the wartime discourse increasingly, mainly because they provide more accurate battlefield assessments. There's an element of authenticity or perceived authenticity. So Telegram is perceived as raw and real. Um, However, as I've kind of been mentioning already, many channels are, not all, but many channels are linked to state structures, oligarchs, security agencies. And so the line between genuine dissent and managed opposition is a very, very blurry one, as always. And finally, that the pro-war channels are diverse, but they share a kind of core ideology, which is they generally believe in the war's necessity, even though such as Hodorkovsky, who had to delete his Telegram channel late last year, who may think that now is the time to end it. They believe essentially in the ideas, the ideology fueling the war, which I don't think we can say about the majority of the Russian population, for example. Though they may acquiesce and approve of it for different reasons, I don't think we can talk about a militarized kind of or a kind of mobilized population behind the war for ideological reasons. What are their core arguments? The inevitability of Ukrainian defeat, but at too high a cost. So they're very reform focused in terms of trying to minimize soldiers' losses. That the military leadership is corrupt and incompetent, mediocrities and saboteurs. It's from the group of the angry patriots who've obviously lost some of their public media presence since Igor Strelkov-Girkin was arrested. So he was the man who kind of started the war in Donbass in 2014 by taking Slavyansk and also helped to shoot down MH17. That there are talented commanders, that the military can't adapt. I mean, all very fair criticisms. They have a strong fear, they're very anti-Western, they have a strong fear of a pro-Western coup and internal sabotage, the idea that there are Western agents undermining Russia from within, particularly Nabuilina, the head of the central bank, which is ironic given that she's incredibly competent and actually it would be much better for everybody who doesn't want Russia to win if she was not in place. And the idea that the political leadership is failing the war effort. Often this is a case of bad boy as good Tsar, if only the Tsar knew. But we'll move on to direct criticism of Putin shortly. And then finally, this idea that they are the true patriots, that they are filling the gaps of key state functions, and that ordinary Russian patriots are doing what the state should be doing, and that there's this idea of two Russias. So there's the Russia that's kind of conscious of this war and is ready to do everything, and then there's the other Russia, and the worst of that other Russia would be the kind of, in their view, westernized elites. So different types of criticism that we measured using like a language learning model. We see that most of the criticism from these groups comes to the army, then political leadership, then of Russian society, then Russian side of war, which is how we defined how Russia fights war. So kind of Russian military, Russia's approach to the military, as opposed to it being a structural issue, it being kind of more of a doctrinal issue. Putin criticism, Russian policy criticism, and Russian ideological criticism. So the idea that there either isn't an ideology or that the ideology is wrong. In general, it's that there isn't an ideology. So military and political leadership are main targets. There is still societal criticism, which reflects dissatisfaction on the part of these nationalist or patriotic policy critics with how Russian society engages with the war. And Putin is criticized less directly than the broader leadership, but the connection, certainly until 2023, which is when I have the last amount of full data, but also we've started working on data for 2024, and it suggests that the trends from 2023 have remained pretty stable but continue to grow in terms of the connection between army failures and Putin's personal leadership. So when did criticism peak? Because I remember in 2024, when I first discussed some of this data, people were surprised. They presumed that after Prigozhin's mutiny, there was a drop, that this kind of group were no longer relevant. But that's not what we're seeing, and that's definitely not what the initial data showed either. So the highest amount of criticism was in time window 4, which was sort of October to November 2023. And there was quite a large kind of jump, especially because obviously during the mutiny, there was a very sharp drop in criticism due to self-censorship and a sense that Prigozhin had obviously gone a bit too far. So you can see sort of a basic window there. So this is Prigozhin's mutiny, time window 3, where everything sort of drops. Before then it was steadily growing, but then it goes back and kind of continues a pretty similar spectrum. And since then we've seen it continue to grow. But as I say, we haven't got the full data yet, so I can only say that's what it suggests. I can't say definitely until we've crunched the numbers. Broad kind of criticism categories that they all sort of engage with. We've been through this a little bit, but yeah, the army criticism, Russian side of war, so under mobilization, the idea that Russia is fighting too nicely, corruption. Criticism of Putin tends to be that he's staying too quiet during crises, that he's not tough enough. Societal criticism we've discussed. There's a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric. That's something that we're finding much more in the 2024 data as well. And particularly a focus on the idea that migrants or non-ethnic Russians are doing well, whilst soldiers or veterans are being disrespected. And policy criticism, yeah, like I said, they really hate the central bank and Navalny. They're increasingly not fans now of Kirienko, another. Well, I mean, obviously I don't spoil him, but he's also another person who's pretty competent, if a bit of a micromanager. So they seem to dislike people who are kind of saving the Russian economy from and the Russian system from itself. But it's interesting. Their main reason is because Kirienko has come out and defended migration, and as a rule, they're not that big a fan of migration. And there's been a fair amount of criticism of Rostec as well, which has been quite consistent over the years. In terms of criticizing Putin, criticism of Putin didn't go back to normal levels even after the mutiny, but we can see we tested different types of correlations. So among this group, so often appears alongside the strongest correlations are when they're criticizing other forms of political leaders, when they're criticizing the army, when they criticize how Russia's conducting the war, so the kind of war strategy, as opposed to societal or ideological or policy criticism. So that's just included because obviously everybody tends to be more interested in opinions on Putin, but the most active critics tend to be the military bloggers and the Wagner affiliated ones. Certainly, sometimes they're outright kind of calling for all manner of horrible things to happen to Putin. So my argument here is that essentially they function as an uncivil society. So they like to often present themselves as independent critics, but they serve as a pressure valve for Putin's regime, channeling nationalist discontent without directly challenging state authority, with the very obvious exception of Prigozhin. Though that in itself is interesting, that the one direct threat to the regime so far since 2022 has been the one real threat has been from this side, from this kind of ideational grouping. That said, I think that their inability to effect real systemic change makes them uncivil society. So that's a civil society that reinforces authoritarian rule rather than challenging it. So it works ultimately to legitimize the state, to suppress dissent, and to divert public frustration, and in the efforts of propaganda and mobilization, particularly mobilization, which is the main reason why they are allowed this freedom. And here's some of the reasons, so just kind of go through them. So controlled dissent, they allow the regime to deflect responsibility while appearing responsive to public concerns. We remember kind of when Putin has had a couple of meetings with the military bloggers, some of them have been brought in to different commissions, in particular the Commission on Mobilization. They're politically embedded, yet pretty powerless. They reflect elite conflicts. They don't really change the system. They're co-opted. They, as we saw with that picture of the Chechen and the Chechen commander and the Nazi commander, they mobilize nationalist sentiments. Obviously, they're not looking for democratic reform, often quite the opposite. They serve as a propaganda tool. They exist in a very repressive media environment, although Telegram is much freer than, of course, other forms. They're disconnected from, I suppose, what we might call the more traditional civil society that focuses on nationalist grievances, war strategy. It's not, and I mean, there's not really much real discussion around policy. Generally, discussions around policy, even if it can get quite specific, such as healthcare in Bryansk region. I remember there was a big discussion in 2023 around this for some reason. But their go-to is always to just ask for that individual to be removed. There's no real kind of like proper engagement beyond war with these kind of political questions. And as such, they reinforce authoritarian stability. However, they may become a future threat. So if we look at some of their influence now, we can say policy, they are often a conduit for policy adjustments. Recently, the Russian government or the military leaders wanted to ban civilian cars. So just like in Ukraine, volunteers bring civilian cars for the military to use. In Russia, you have a pretty similar thing. And the military wanted to ban this. I don't know why they wanted to ban it, but they did. And that has been essentially, if not formally, then informally overturned because of the lobbying of patriotic policy critics, the military bloggers, and so on. It also therefore provides a feedback loop. And what's really interesting, there was an interesting BBC documentary by Grigor Artanisian on this about how they have, even some of those channels that are the most critical of the MOD, they are in direct contact with the Russian MOD and they provide them with certain information beforehand in order to give them this feedback so that they might respond. Often they don't respond or don't respond in the way that the nationalists feel is necessary, leading to the kind of frustrations, but there is this feedback loop. And of course, they then are able to shape or have an influence on military policy through their media influence. We particularly saw that in 2022 around mobilization. And I think if there was ever another round of mobilization in Russia, we would see they would have, considering they sit on these commissions, they would also have insight into impact on that. In terms of regime stability, they act as an important venting mechanism, particularly for soldiers or for people in the war. They reinforce some regime resilience really because they provide an outlet for grassroots discontent, but it's kind of a paradoxical one because they're exposing incompetence as well. So it's a difficult one for the state to manage perfectly. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the way that the state sought to co-opt liberals, to a certain extent, in the 2000s and also in the 2010s. And of course, the Prigozhin precedent showed that there are some pretty clear limits to the tolerance that they are allowed. But if we look more broadly at society and where they're kind of getting their legitimization from, firstly, from the war reporting, from the frontline credibility, they are there in Ukraine. They're not in a Moscow studio. Secondly, through fundraising. So this is a picture from a fundraising effort. So they raise funds for drones, thermal imaging devices. Reba, he even has an English language account, kind of military blogger, also organised fundraisers as well. Two majors and other Telegram groups have coordinated donations for medical kits. Two majors now has its own charity. The Ukrainians have been very good at diverting that and in fact managed to get equipment from two majors with the general Ukrainian skill for dismantling or disrupting systems. But obviously it does have an effect in terms of how they're viewed because they're there and they are helping the soldiers. Thirdly, there are other ways that they've helped. So they use their platforms to highlight issues, thinking here, for example, of figures like Anastasia Kashivarova, who's done a lot about kind of the legal side. And though they don't tend to look at the wives, and yeah, exposing corruption. I'm just going to kind of wrap up because I want to leave enough time for questions as well, but I'll quickly go through it. And then they've also got organizational support. So they've got organizational experience here. So thinking here about Society Future, which has set up kind of people's first aid kits, and they've been creating communities. What's more, obviously, Telegram and online are, though television still remains very influential in Russia, clearly online media is only going to grow. So the future, I think for all of these reasons and for the reasons we've discussed, they are likely to continue to have influence as a group in Russia and in post-war Russia. I think in terms of what type of influence it will be, that will depend on how the war ends. If, as seems very unlikely, Russia loses badly, then I think we're more likely to see them become an actual opposition. In general, they don't like deals. If Russia wins or secures a frozen conflict, then I think they'll be absorbed into the system. Crisis or collapse, that's where I think things get very interesting, as you know, some of them already are essentially paramilitary leaders. And they could play a role in civil unrest because, again, they don't represent a majority, but they are a minority that's ideological, politicized, and many of which have experience with guns. And then, of course, the other option also likely is if Putin purges them. I think that will be difficult to do given the sheer number of people who've been to the war and that therefore have sympathies with them, because then he would need another way to kind of find an outlet for some of these views to prevent them from bubbling over. And the risk then is that they're pushed underground, and really the Kremlin did a great job in dismantling the ethno-nationalists after 2014 through a mixture of kind of co-opting their arguments, using Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, and also just your general arresting them. Never goes out of fashion. And I think but he could do that again. So whether or not they're a nationalist, they can become a nationalist opposition or just remain patriotic policy critics will depend on the trajectory of a post-war Russia. But I don't think that they will disappear. And I think their role in Russian politics is very far from over. And I think they'll probably have an important impact on post-war and indeed post-Putin Russia in radical and unexpected ways. Thank you.